take them out?
Yeah, or just whenever you have an answer
Okay.
question.
Okay. There we go. Okay.
Yeah, just for the in-person, but we have a lot of folks who watch on our live stream, it's convenient. Exactly.
Out
Yeah.
there.
First of all, thank you so much for those of you joining us in person here today, and those of you joining us online on our live stream. Welcome to Carytown Concert House. We have a wonderful pre-concert Q&A for you today with some incredible musicians. Before we get going here, we'd just like to thank a few folks. We'd like to thank the Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation. Without their support, none of this would be possible. And we'd also love to thank our wonderful in-person attendees here, Linda and Mari Binko, who are incredible supporters of all our Salon Series concerts, and we're really thankful for their support. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce everybody at home and here in the audience to two folks who really need no introduction, but I will give one anyways, to two marvelous musicians. I'm going to begin to my left here. This is the great Camille Jones, the great violinist Camille Jones, who is a recent graduate of the master's program at the University of Michigan and a rising star in the music that we're all really excited about. And next to Camille, joining us today is one of the greats of all time. This is Professor Anthony Elliott, the wonderful cellist. And we're going to get to hear from both of these folks today. Yes, indeed. And so thank you both for being here with us.
Delighted to be here with you.
Awesome. Yeah, so we're going to talk about a lot of things today, but the first thing that I want to get into, which is at the core of this Passing the Torch series, is this idea of, we have a lot of musicians, who get mentored in school settings and in academia, and we have students who go to universities and get to study with great teachers. But then what we're trying to encourage here at the house is, after those students finish their degrees, there's still a lot of learning and growing to do, and there's still a lot of music to be made, and trying to facilitate those connections between folks in the community who are established, and wise beyond their years and still have insights to provide to some youngsters who are getting started and have full careers in front of them. So I want to start with you, Camille, as a new graduate of the university. Congratulations again. What are some of the things that have been important about studying, or not necessarily studying, but working with Professor Elliott outside of the university setting, in a really professional context like this?
So one of the things that has been really important for me is just being able to get to know the community better. And so yeah, I didn't know Professor Elliott before. I knew he was a teacher at the University of Michigan, and a lot of people loved him.
A lot, I will emphasize. We all love Professor Elliott.
But yeah, so it was really cool to be able to make that connection with someone that I had kind of heard about already, and yeah, so, and also just I think as an introduction to Ann Arbor, it's also nice to perform in such a popular concert setting here, and so yeah, I would say that this kinds of opportunity is really great in terms of networking and also reaching the broader community where you're currently working at or studying at, and just getting to know the logistics behind putting on actual concerts outside of school.
Definitely, yeah, getting that professional experience. Kind of piggyback off of that, Professor Elliott, I'm curious, from your perspective as somebody who had an incredible tenure at the University of Michigan and beyond that, teaching, all over the globe and as such a tremendous educator, how have you seen, since retiring from the U of M, you're still continuing these relationships with young musicians and can still being such a formative force in their lives, and we see it here with Camille and a lot of other folks in the community. Why is it important to you to continue that past your tenure at a university, for instance?
Well, there's two important parts of this to me. One is, of course, I want to be able to give back because I know that were it not for a few strategically placed people in my life, I would not be here, either as a cellist or as a musician. And so I'm extremely grateful for some of those early influences who were able to impart to me a sense of what it was going to take to become a professional musician. So I do want to give back in that sense, but also it's been a learning experience for me too, in that I learned as much playing with Camille as I impart in giving to Camille. We've had a great esprit de corps, a great working relationship, and I think that's an important part of being a musician. There's certain kind of fundamental principles that I think are useful in collaboration. One of them is sometimes to not necessarily discuss an idea until you actually try it, because it may be that the idea and the verbiage that came out of the person that imparted the idea may in fact be a little bit different. And so it's useful sometimes to actually try the idea and just see if you can make the other person's idea sound great. Because if you can make their idea sound great, you may find that, hey, they're going to be a little more open to trying some of the suggestions that you have down the road. And one of the most important things for a musician starting out as Camille is that you want to be asked back, you know, because word of mouth is the biggest way of establishing a career as a musician. So the more that people will be saying, hey, I heard about Camille Jones. I heard she's really wonderful and she's great to work with. So let's see if we can't get her to come and play on our concert in Baltimore. Let's see if we can't get her to come and play in Los Angeles with us. That's how it happens. And so, imparting those types of ideas is very, very important to me.
Definitely. Yeah, beautifully stated. I love what you had to say about, coming to musicians interested in what they offer, and saying, hey, I want to make music with you. And then, I have these other musical experiences. Maybe we can try this or try that, and finding some middle ground here. And I think that not only is that an important skill, but it's something that it's beautiful to see conscientiously put into action, and inspiring to see that. And I think that's particularly interesting when we have collaborations, that are between folks that are less familiar with each other. Like we'd mentioned, you all did not know each other when we had began this series, and that's part of the exciting thing about this series. We've been able to connect folks in the community who had never met each other, and it was almost this, let's see what happens, like let's see what will come of this, and the results have been really beautiful. And particularly in this series, one of the ways in which we wanted to do that, and the way we thought about that, was we kind of recognized that in a lot of situations, whether it's music or outside of music, the generations of musicians or generations of lawyers or architects or doctors, they stick together. It's the younger musicians coming up love to play with the other younger musicians, and the more established musicians love to play with the more established musicians. And not to say that there's no cross-generational collaboration, but it's really wonderful to see more of that. So I'm curious, Camille, what are your thoughts on the importance of intergenerational collaboration and working with somebody that isn't maybe somebody you went to school with, and somebody who has a different experience than you, and a plethora of experience doing what it is that you will do?
Yeah. I think it's very necessary. Just to be a well-rounded person, you have to surround yourself with various different types of people who have different perspectives, people who don't necessarily agree with you all the time. And so I'm just yelling into the mic, sorry. So yeah, I feel like it's from that standpoint, it's very necessary. I also feel like if you're a young person, it would be very kind of naive to think that you wouldn't need the advice of someone who is older and who has like been in your position before, or and who's like more established. And even if like they grew up in a slightly different time than you, like the facts are that they have more life experience, and so they're going to be able to offer a lot of wise words. And the other thing I was going to say is I think also as I think it's mentorship is also important in this context in terms of connecting people from maybe more marginalized backgrounds as well, because I feel like in a lot of these settings, they can be very kind of homogenous. And so, and when you're a new person in a new place, like finding someone who looks like you or represents you in some way to like kind of guide you or like give you some tips and things like that, that's also very important. It's very helpful.
Beautifully said. Yes, we could not agree more. I want to jump into something that you said with Professor Elliott a little bit, and thinking about life beyond the university and what the future will look like and what your career will look like going forward. And Professor Elliott, if you wouldn't mind, I would be curious, to kind of to go back into your life and back into your upbringing, as a musician, and maybe painting a picture, as a fresh graduate from Indiana University, like as Camille is a fresh graduate of the University of Michigan, and what the world, or what your career kind of looked like to you at that time, and maybe kind of describing how things started to form for you as a soloist and as a musician, and as to become who you are today in a lot of ways, and then maybe jumping off of that too and saying, what advice might you have to somebody like Camille who's in a similar situation, who's just recently graduated from the university and is, the world is their oyster, so to speak. But what was your experience in that regard?
Well, I can say that when I graduated from college, I really had no idea what the heck I was doing. And so at that point, I decided, well, maybe I should try to gain an orchestra position, because that might be a good way I could, establish my independence. My parents had just put 3 children through college, and I knew there was no question of grad school. So I sent letters to all of the symphony orchestras in the country and asked if they had an opening for a cellist. At that point, I didn't even know about the International Musician, which is the one newspaper that people always open from the back, because that's where the ads are of all the positions where the orchestras are going to be hiring. So I wrote about 100 letters out there, and I got 3 letters back from orchestras that had openings, 2 of which were in Canada, the Montreal Symphony and the Toronto Symphony. And so I thought, well, okay, I guess I'm going to go and audition for these orchestras. And Toronto was the very first one. And it was an amazing setting, because I got to Toronto and they took me into this basement room which had all of these cellists in it. And it was a very boomy, echoey room, and they all sounded fantastic. I mean, they all sounded like Rostropovich as they were playing their Dvorak concerto and this and that. And finally, one fella came over to me, and he had a leather hard cello case, which was leather. I'd never seen such a thing. And he said, like my case? Piatigorsky gave it to me. I said, wow. Oh, really? Yeah, very interesting. And he said, I can't really decide what concerto I'm going to play, whether I should play Prokofiev or if I should play Dvorak or Haydn D. And he started throwing down these scores of all of these concertos in front of me and said, "What do you think I should play?" And I said, "Well, I really have no idea." I'm thinking to myself, I've got myself kind of fully occupied trying to play one concerto well, to say nothing about choosing from this guy's dozen. So I went off and found a quiet corner to be by myself, collect my thoughts, and so on. And as it happened, I did get hired, I did get the job. But I wasn't expecting that someone was going to come up and try to do basically a psych job on me. And, so you never know what's going to happen at an audition, and you have to be prepared to whatever the result is. If you get the job, great. If you don't get the job, rather than complain or anything, use that experience as fuel to improve oneself, to shore up anything that you thought was a shortcoming in that particular experience. If they felt your sound wasn't good, then you work on sound. If they felt your technique wasn't good, you work on technique. If they felt you were whatever, you use it as fuel so that the next time around you're that much better armed. And I think it's something that wound up being helpful for me, and I think it can be helpful for young musicians. Also, another thing that and I think I mentioned this to Camille, and that is the idea of never being more than 4 weeks removed from being audition ready for an experience. That is to say, if your goal is an orchestra job, and that's not the goal for everybody, but for some it is, then you should have kind of a core repertory, those things that show up most frequently on auditions. Those things should really be in your back pocket so that you can play them in your sleep. And then you can add whatever the particular things are that orchestra does that might be slightly outside the margins. Because there's always, this orchestra does that a little bit on their auditions. The Chicago Symphony loves to do this one section of Tannhauser. They've been doing it for years. They love to have that on their cello auditions. And so knowing that, you've got to have that in your back pocket if you're going to audition for them.
Awesome. Yes, that is very wise advice all the way through. And one of the things that I love most about what you said too was not knowing, what the future had for you as a fresh graduate of Indiana University. And then, this psych job at the audition, there's no way to predict that, but the way that you were able to take that in stride and learn from that experience, it's a testament to the fact that you didn't think you knew it all at that age. You were ready to learn and you were ready to grow, and obviously it paid off. so it's very sage advice. So you take notes, those of you at home. I want to ask one more question of Camille, and then I want to open it up to our in-person folks here if you all have any questions. But the final question that I have for you, Camille, I had Professor Elliott paint the picture of, fresh as an Indiana University graduate, and maybe that picture is a little bit more vivid for you as a fresh University of Michigan graduate today, in 2022.
Mm-hmm.
And it's no secret that, the landscape of society across the board, not just in music, has changed, over the last several decades here. And I'm curious, as a up-and-coming musician and somebody, who's getting their start, but also is already quite accomplished, what are the things that excite you about, the musical ecosystem that exists in 2022? And what are the things that, you are optimistic about as you start to begin your career? Again, the world is your oyster, but it's a different oyster than it was a few decades ago.
I've been talking about this with a couple of my friends lately, because I do feel like, even though I have the similar feeling as Professor Elliott, is I'm not really sure what I'm gonna do. Like, I thought I had a couple of plans, but then I ended up like not doing them, and so now I'm kind of like, we're gonna figure it out this year. Um, but I do feel like some exciting things that I've been seeing is just people moving away from like the traditional kind of model of performing music. I've been seeing a lot of my colleagues just really just kind of like going against certain uh, trends or like what we've seen like in the past, you know, and yeah, and like creating their own albums and lots more composers, like people making their own music, young people of various different backgrounds, and um, people make joining like a boy band. Like I've heard about that and stuff. Just like really fun things and like kind of getting to know the various different ways that you can make a career out of being a musician besides just like doing orchestra and teaching. And so I'm optimistic about the way that young people today are redefining how they view like the like just a traditional concert setting. And yeah, so that's kind of what I'm optimistic about, and I look forward to following along in that kind of way, like kind of making my own path and like thinking creatively about like how exactly I ultimately see myself as an artist beyond like what you're typically told.
Absolutely, yeah. And one of the really inspiring things that I've seen from you, Camille, is you're not detaching yourself from this tradition either. You're eager with these to seek out these new perspectives and these new sounds, but are continuing to stay studied of the tradition that came before you. And I think having one foot in the future and one foot in the past, and then you somehow exist somewhere between that and the present. It's a really inspiring thing to see from young musicians. At this time, I'm curious if any of our in-person guests have any questions that they'd like to ask of Professor Elliott and Camille. So just for our live stream viewers at home, I'm going to reiterate the question. Maury asked and I'd be quite curious to know both of your thoughts on this, and we'll begin with Professor Elliott. But the question of when somebody comes to you, and with a question about auditioning or wanting to work with you, how do you teach the nonverbal communication element of playing music together? And I think. Yeah, especially chamber music and that ability to communicate with each other. So, Professor Elliott, if you could elaborate.
It's one of the most important things that I think we have to do, and it can be challenging because it has to begin with an understanding that one could end up being in a string quartet. One might end up, because of the growth of entrepreneurship that we're seeing, one could end up in a group like Time for Free, or one could end up in a group like, I'm trying to remember the group of the two cellists. Is it the two cellos? Is that what it is? Is it just called the two cellos? Maybe it's the two cellos. And there are these wonderful fellows from Australia that have a group which is called, I believe it's Two Set. And the creativity that they've had is really enormous. So what I think we have to do is to first of all impart to the student the importance of them being aware of something other than just their own part. Because if they're locked into their part, they're not communicating with anybody else, and people will feel the wall that's between them and the rest of the group. and people will say that they don't want to play with that person anymore. So the first thing I try to do is to try to get people to understand, and whether it's a sonata they're playing with piano or a string quartet, that they have to know the other parts in that ensemble just as well as they know their own. And that's sort of a beginning point. From there, you move on to an understanding of nonverbals in terms of cueing, how to do cueing so that people know when to come in. And sometimes that takes time to get used to, whether or not you should move abruptly or whether you have to move slowly, and it depends a lot on the nature and character of the music, how one's body language needs to adapt to that. But it's really important. If one sits and plays like a board, again, people will feel that wall between you and them. So, but it begins, I think, for me with an understanding of the score and knowing what the other person has. And in that sense, you can think about using your gestures to make the other person's job a little bit easier. How can I help them be able to come in? And what kind of gesture helps the clarinet to come in, or what kind of gesture helps the violinist to come in, or what kind of gesture helps the pianist to begin with you. We had an issue last evening in our rehearsal where the cellist gave a bad cue, and I had to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, I want to do that again. Let's try it this way. And we did, and it worked. But, so that's something that is a beginning of an ongoing process of experimentation that goes on all your life to find the right kind of gestural language that helps the musicians around you perform at their best level. And that's one of the exciting things about playing chamber music, and also conducting, because I'm also a conductor, so that leads me to be exploring that all the time.
Very beautiful, beautifully stated. Camille, kind of just jumping along those lines, I'm curious, how do you see that type of interaction? What are the differences, perhaps in playing in an orchestra setting versus playing in a chamber setting, in terms of how does that communication differ amongst the musicians? And maybe it does, or maybe it doesn't?
I think that they're very similar. And so, in order to be a great orchestra musician, you definitely have to be a great chamber musician. And obviously, it's different because you can't, physically connect with, every single person in the orchestra, in the way that you would in, a smaller ensemble. You're not, breathing together like that necessarily. I mean, you should try, right? Depending on where you are in the music. And you're kind of, it's different because you're paying more attention to the conductor, so you're trying to connect with the conductor. I feel like with orchestra, it's a very interesting challenge because it's chamber music, but with a lot more stimuli. And so it's a lot there's so many more moving parts that you kind of have to be aware of, the people behind you, the people in front of you, the conductor, the winds, people all the way across the orchestra. And if you aren't prepared, then all of that stimuli can just overwhelm you, and then might become a wall, and it's just the music, the music is controlling you or whatever, you know what I mean? So yeah, I think it's this interesting exercise in patience and preparedness, yeah. That's what I'll say.
I love that, patience and preparedness. That's really well stated, and such fantastic insights from both of you. Unfortunately, I believe we're just about out of time here for our Q&A session, but I'd like to thank both of you again, Professor Elliott, Camille, for being here, and it's such a pleasure and an honor to have you both on our stage. And we really hope the folks that are at home on our live stream and the folks that are in person can join us tonight at 8 p.m. for what will be a marvelous concert. Talk about two incredible communicators of this music. You know, we're really in for a treat tonight, and we hope that you can join us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.